I've always believed that the best memories are made far from home, away from cell towers, streetlights, and the constant hum of modern life. Every summer, without fail, I packed up the tent, loaded the SUV, and drove my family into the wilderness. This year we picked a new spot, a place Leah found buried deep in an old camping forum, Black Pine Creek, a forested pocket of northern Idaho that never quite made it onto mainstream maps. It wasn't too far off the beaten path, but just remote enough that the roads thinned, gas stations grew sparse, and GPS signals flickered out somewhere along the way. The area didn't have a proper campground, just scattered fire pits and bare clearings, left behind by hunters and drifters over the years. To me, it sounded perfect. Pure forest. Pure silence. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped low enough to stretch the pines into jagged silhouettes. The landscape was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, a dense tangle of black pines and soft, yellowed grass, stitched together with the smell of earth, sap, and something slightly sour that I couldn't place at first. I remember stepping out of the car and pausing, struck by the strange stillness. No wind, no birds. Just the soft crunch of boots on dry moss as the kids, Ben and Ellie, bounded around the clearing, exploring the limits of our little patch of wilderness. Leah and I worked in silence, setting up the tent, stacking firewood, arranging the cooler. The shadows grew longer. The light faded. And then the wind came. A single sharp gust that bent the branches sideways and rattled the canopy above, sending a fine mist of pine needles down onto our tent. The smell that followed wasn't the clean scent of forest air, but something dry, bitter, and old, like burned hair or withered flowers. That night we sat around the fire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows, the kids' laughter easing the tension I hadn't realized had crept into my bones. Leah seemed relaxed, or at least she faked it well. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't as alone as the maps had promised. I chalked it up to nerves. New places always did this to me. But then the drums started. At first it was so faint, I mistook it for my own heartbeat. A low, rhythmic thump rising from somewhere deep in the forest. It was too steady, too deliberate to be an animal. I listened, frozen, as the sound grew louder. Leah noticed it too. Her face stiffened, her head tilting like a dog hearing a far-off whistle. Curiosity was the trap that got me out of my chair. I grabbed the flashlight and crept away from the fire, weaving through the pines. The sound pulled me along like a tether. With every step, the air grew colder, the ground underfoot softer, as if I were walking on something freshly dug. I killed the flashlight when I saw the light ahead. Not the warm flicker of a campfire, but a sharp, white-hot glow that seemed too bright for flame. The clearing was perfect. Circular, smooth, the grass stripped away as if scoured clean. 12 figures stood around a roaring fire, their robes a weathered, colourless grey that hung off their frames like tattered sails. Their hoods hung low, faces buried deep in shadow, arms raised in slow, synchronised movements like marionettes tugged by unseen strings. And then I saw the slab. It lay in front of the fire, rough-hewn and blackened by time. On top of it, something bound in ropes, too long and limp to be an animal. The body was human, still, motionless. My stomach turned and every hair on my neck stood upright. The chant started low, like a swarm of hornets inside my skull. The sound wasn't carried by their mouths but seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I took a step backward, snapping a branch beneath my heel. The chanting stopped. 12 heads turned in perfect unison, their faces still hidden, but I could feel the weight of their gaze settle on me, sharp as a blade against the back of my neck. I bolted, tearing through the trees, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. The drums followed, slower now, more methodical, as if counting down to something. When I burst into the clearing where we'd camped, Leah was standing rigid beside the fire, the kids huddled behind her. She'd heard the chanting too. It hadn't stayed confined to the woods. Even from the camp, the sound had bled through, souring the night air like invisible smoke. The world around us shifted. The crickets had gone silent. The breeze vanished. The fire dimmed to a soft, struggling ember. I stood motionless, listening to the space beyond the light, where the shadows twitched and flickered in ways that defied the windless night. Shapes moved at the perimeter of the camp. Not human, not animal. Gliding, twitching, impossible to pin down. The temperature nosedived. I could see the breath pluming from my kids' mouths, hanging in the air like wisps of fog. The shadows drew closer, their shapes becoming clearer. 12 figures. Hoods low, robes rippling even though the air was still. The fire finally snuffed itself out, the darkness folding over us like wet cloth. The forest pressed closer, the space shrinking as if the world itself were tightening. The humming returned, the same note as the chant but deeper, bone deep. It crawled through my chest and settled behind my eyes, dull and sharp at once. I tried to move, to lift a limb, but my muscles locked. My breath came shallow and sharp, like the air had thickened into syrup. My kids whimpered behind me, and even through the paralysis, the primal drive to shield them seared through me, useless against whatever force held me pinned. The 12 figures began moving again, slow and measured, stepping around us in a wide, deliberate circle. As they passed, the air warped around them, the scent of old blood and burned earth trailing behind like exhaust. The ground trembled, the soil shifting in tiny ripples, as though something enormous stirred beneath it, coiled and waiting. A single, drawn-out note rose from the woods, higher and higher until my ears rang. My vision dimmed, and for a moment I thought I would black out. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. The figures paused, their heads tilting toward the sky, and turned away, gliding back into the dark. The normal world returned like a snapped rubber band. The fire flared back to life, the crickets resumed their song, the air warmed, and the night looked exactly as it had before. But none of us moved until the first hint of dawn bled into the sky. We packed the car in silence, our hands shaking, the kids unusually obedient as they climbed into their seats. The forest felt thinner, like it had stretched and bent during the night, but was now trying to wear the same skin. On the drive home, no one spoke. The radio crackled with static the entire way, even though the stations should have come through clear long before we hit the highway. Only when we crossed the county line did the static fade and the world return to its ordinary, unthreatening self. At home, Leah found something folded in with the camping gear. A piece of parchment, worn and yellowed, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to swim if you stared at them too long. We burned it in the fireplace without a word. But the damage was done. For weeks afterward, each of us would wake at exactly 3:33 a.m., our hearts racing, the faint sound of distant drums bleeding through the quiet walls of our home. We never went back to Black Pine Creek. And sometimes when the wind changes, I still smell that bitter scent of burned earth and blood, and I know the forest hasn't finished with us.